welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us today, the 2021 International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and also the 15th anniversary of the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, also known as the CRPD. I'm Charlotte Dales, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Inclusively. This is a technology-centered employment and training platform connecting disabled job seekers to inclusive companies. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a white woman with brown hair wearing a black blouse. I'm really excited to be joining this esteemed panel to discuss the importance of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. This treaty passed 15 years ago, and it created a global movement, especially in the area of employment of people with disabilities, and created opportunity for technology innovation that is disrupting the status quo. We have an incredible group of leaders contributing to this conversation, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Frances West. She's the founder of FrancesWestCo and former IBM Chief Accessibility Officer. She's globally recognized thought leader and expert in digital inclusion strategy, and she was actually there in 2006 working with different stakeholders while the CRPD was signed. She's also an incredibly valuable advisor to Inclusively, and I will hand it over to her to give a more formal intro on herself.
Oh, thank you very much, Charlotte. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe even good evening. My name is Frances West, founder of FrancesWestCo. I go by a she, her pronoun, and I'm an over 50 plus Asian woman. I'm not going to give my age away. And this is just a delightful morning. I'm calling in from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm very honored to host this very, very diverse and international panel. And like Charlotte said, today is the 15th anniversary of this particular human rights treaty. And for those of us who are in the digital accessibility or digital inclusion world, we all can think back on the day when this treaty was passed, the first human rights treaty that's actually re-embedded some technology kind of underpinnings. So we do have a very large panel today because we want to have the audience, to introduce to the audience a different perspective, both from the government sector, in this case, lead with United Nations, all the way to private sectors, and also to startups, right? Because what we want to do is to really share with you how this treaty, how this policy that was set at the United Nations level actually have a material impact on technology innovation, and how it actually led to some of the incredible solutions that we're seeing coming out of both what we call enterprise, large customers, global customers, and also from, and then most excitingly, from startups. So we see the next generation of technology solution coming into play, and we can all trace back to the date of 2006 when the treaty was signed. And one of the architect of this treaty, and also the person really initiated inside United Nations, is the Ambassador Gales, who's on the call today. We're just delighted to have him here. And he's going to give us his perspective on the background. Now, I do want to say that we also have other panelists, Isabel Hodge, Executive Director of the U.S. International Council of Disability. You said actually play a significant role connecting with the private sectors in supporting this. And we also have John Kemp, and John Kemp, many of you knows, was actually the founder of a USBLN, now is Disability In, and then he's been the CEO of the Viscardi School for many years, but just most recently, 10 days ago, the CEO of Lakeshore, and then Christopher Lee, the Vice President, Chief Learning Officer of IAAP, part of the G3ICT, that focusing on bringing technology, infrastructure, including accessibility to the world. And last but not the least, Crosby Cromwell, who's a good friend of mine, and she was just announced this week earlier to be the Chief Partner Officer of a Valuable 500. We all know how Valuable 500 is fundamentally changing, creating a sea change, and you're going to hear from her later. So now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to Ambassador Gales. I do want to remind our participant that because it's a large panel, so please try to limit your perspective to 3 minutes or so, and so that we have time to go around to ask additional questions and also time for Q&A. So with that, Ambassador Gale.
Thank you very much, Frances. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you. Greetings from Malaga, Spain. I am here promoting an initiative for active aging, which is one of the concepts we got out of the convention of the CRPD. You're either born with a disability or you acquire it during your life by accident or by sickness or whatever other reason. But certainly as you age, and I am a person that has to confess that I'll be 75 the 13th of December. A very unique day, because the 13th of December of 2006, the CRPD was approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The United Nations had worked 20 years on the decades for persons with disabilities, on the issues of disabilities. But it was only until 2002 that a resolution was approved in the General Assembly to create a working group. And I had the honor of being elected by unanimity as the chair of the group that elaborated the convention from 2002 to 2005. Don McKay, the ambassador from New Zealand, took up the baton, and on December 13, 2006, the CRPD was approved. It's the first human rights convention of the United Nations during this century, and it is the most successful one because it has 183 members that practically is the global universal membership of the United Nations. I also had the honor of being in the White House in July 2009 when President Obama signed the CRPD. And I have the distinct honor of having one of the pens that he signed the convention that he gave me as a momentum of this historic moment in which the United States signed the CRPD. I believe that it has changed paradigmatically the lives of millions of people. The target of population is, of course, 1 billion persons with disabilities. Some calculate that from the last count in 2011, by now it should be 1.3 billion people. I can say also that that number has to be increased with the shareholders, with the families of persons with disabilities, which give you a group of around 2.5 to 3 billion people who have a direct linkage with disability. I'll go back to the point in where the impact has changed. Certainly has changed me. I'm a negotiator. I'm a person that is not an expert on disability, but I have become a staunch activist of the belief that this is owned by the disability community. We owe it to them, and we owe it to people like you who have been able to change the world to make it a better place for those who are the most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I think you talked about a personal change. I mean, all of us, after we started in this area, we individually all made a decision to continue this journey and continue to be involved. And I can speak to that. And so now we're going to pass on to Isabel. For Isabel to share what, even though United States have not signed the treaty, but United States was a leader in terms of its thought leadership, and a lot of the UN treaty actually is modeled after the US. So Isabel, we'd love to hear from your perspective what US's role in this signing, and also what are you doing currently with your organization? You're on mute, Isabel.
There we go. So yes, the U.S. International Council on Disabilities led the campaign for the ratification of the CRPD back in 2012, and then again in 2014. And several people on the call today were involved in that, namely John Kemp and people like Tony Coelho and Mark Abristo. So unfortunately, we fell a few votes short in the Senate to have the ratification happen. But as Senator Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said last night at our gala, he said, the bill, the package is still alive. There's still the opportunity to try again. And so we're really looking to 2022 and the midterm elections to see where we are with Republicans especially.
Frances, you're on mute.
Thank you, John. I know we all got to do that once, right? Yeah, I distinctly remember we were 6 votes short in getting this thing ratified, and I was walking up and down the hall at the time with guidance from actually Mr. John Kemp, who's next to share, because at the time John was working with us. When I say us, IBM, in trying to really rally the support for this. So John, could you take us back through the memory lane of where, and how you and your organization contributed to this?
Well, thank you. And it is a privilege to be on this panel with such distinguished people. And thank you very much for the invitation. I do think back to the mid-2000s, the aught years. And I do recall very clearly that the disability community was learning about its own culture and really appreciating who we are and elevating ourselves up to believe that we rightfully and righteously belong as equals in all aspects of society. And I think that was the underpinning that Ambassador Gallegos identified in 2002 when the resolution was approved to create the body that started studying this issue in the United States. A number of advocates were far ahead of industry at that time. Not all industry. You take progressives like IBM and Frances West, they were very far out in front, but not everybody was following. So I think about the issue of leadership in this area. And back then it was Ambassador Gallegos, it was Frances West, it was PJ Eddington at IBM. It was Judy Brewer at W3C. It was Jim Fruchterman, Greg Vanderheiden. It was people like that helped start the discussion of pushing and lifting this up. But there are 2 elements that I want to point out. One is that among people with disabilities, we were learning about our culture, our disability culture, and the transmission of our culture is really heightened by the accessibility and use of the internet and the World Wide Web. And our inability to access those powerful tools easily and readily and in real time really limited our ability to discuss among ourselves and elevate ourselves as a civil rights movement here in the United States and globally. Then you take that out to just being citizens of the world, being consumers and employers and employees, and just looking at the way we communicate and socialize. We realized that there was something terribly, terribly wrong. And I will say that when the treaty was finally passed, there were at least 5 or 6 provisions in the treaty that identified accessible ICT, information and communication technologies, and that was probably the culmination. We've been playing catch up, and civil rights comes too slowly to many of us who are progressive. We're frustrated by it, but at the same time, we have great hope for the future. So that's the context, I think, that I wanted to make sure that people understood.
Well, and talk about giving context and talked about it has been a very interesting journey, even for private sector. When we started looking at this field, Ambassador mentioned that this is aging population is just so obvious to us that, disability, whether you are born, but eventually you acquire disability through aging, as I can attest to that personally as I get older, and that the market potential is huge. And for those of us who recognize that early on, it's still sometimes puzzles me why we didn't have as much, you call it following, or, as much that it's taking, decades, but the wave definitely is coming in. and that I think you're mentioning about technology has to be part of the human rights or any kind of rights thinking, because we are a society run by technology now and integrated into our lives, how we learn, how we live, how we work, how we socialize. So with that, I think it's absolutely critical, like you mentioned, to have a technology as part of the implementation. And I remember, frankly, feeling a little lonely out there as a company, and but that said, I want to turn to Christopher Lee, because G3ICT, Excel Abroad at the time, who's the founder of G3ICT, it was Ambassador myself and Excel in the Millennium Hotel in New York City. We just sit in the lobby and we say, you know what, we got to do something. And of course, Excel Abroad then went on to establish G3ICT, which is now becoming a body of knowledge where people can go to. So with that, I want to turn it over to Christopher Lee to really have you take us through, some of the, even though you weren't there because you're too young, Christopher, but what you are doing with G3ICT through the IAAP initiative.
Oh, wow, Francis, it's great to be here, and it's great to be here with this incredible panel. Thank you for the invitation. And I feel a little awkward because Excel's just right down the, couple rooms away. And it's been an honor to work for G3ICT that has been around since 2006. It was really formed with the idea and launched with the idea of promoting the CRPD. And since 2006, G3ICT has just done amazing work with partners, which is what we're all about, is partnering with organizations to really look at particularly how the CRPD is being implemented. And we've talked a little bit about that already. And that's a challenge. I mean, the globe is a big globe, and understanding Article 9 and understanding how you drill down to ensure that we are really making a difference with the work that's being done with the CRPD is an important cause. And G3ICT back in 2014 launched their DARE Index. And their DARE Index focuses on an index, kind of a report card of how countries are actually implementing the CRPD, mostly around the ICT particular areas. And if we have a chance later on, I'll read you some of these results with the 2020 refresh of the DARE Index and how far we have come from 2006 in all kinds of capacity building and policy building and accommodation definitions and so on, being within the government's, these countries' governments' arenas. So it's pretty exciting. And I'll be happy to share more with you in just a few minutes.
Well, great, thank you. I think, again, going back to the original construct or the spirit of a treaty is that I think the UN really set an aspirational goal for all government, but in this case, also private sector to aspire to, right? I mean, when I look at this treaty, I always think about the Kyoto Treaty for the environmental movement that was, set, I think, in 1999 or something like that. And then how that created a business, it created a carbon trading. There's new business model actually evolved out of that particular climate and environmental changes. And we can just see the parallel changes happening in this field, in the sense that, it started out with a human rights kind of decree and the framework, but with the organizations like G3ICT and also various advocacy groups pushing, and also in some cases pulling, and then in few cases, some of the business really are leading, are beginning to understand what I call the innovators, right? That they see that this is a bigger, actually it's a win-win situation, both for the humanity, from the human rights standpoint, but also from business. So I think that is something that we all believe that has to happen, because frankly, we are living in a political environment. Sometimes things don't get done as easily, so it's going to take the private sector to step in, because we have the more nimbleness and flexibility. So with that, I want to turn it over to Crosby, because Crosby, your new role at Valuable 500 is just absolutely timely, and would love to hear from your perspective, relating back to CRPD and how Valuable 500 is further, pushing, and pulling the final impact of what the treaty is about, which is economic self-sufficiency through things like employment, right?
Sure, and thank you, Frances. It's wonderful to be here with everyone today. For an audio description, I have long red hair. I'm wearing a pink dress. I have skin that will always, always burn in the sun, and I'm coming to you from my apartment in Washington, D.C. So as Frances said, I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer of the Valuable 500. Just a little bit of context of what this organization is. We are all about driving disability inclusion at the highest levels of leadership. So our CEOs understanding, committing, and advancing disability inclusion around the world. We represent 500 companies in 41 countries with 22 million employees and over 8 trillion annually in revenue. So where we are and what we're doing, it's the conversation, Frances, that you said so eloquently before, is thinking back to 2006 and beyond, of you standing in rooms by yourself and feeling like the lonely leader and the lonely company. And it's about changing that conversation. If we think about the advancements we've had since 2006 and where we are now post CRPD, is look at the CEO Business Roundtable in 2019 and then putting a stake in the ground around changing the way that companies think about people, about the humanity of the stakeholder versus the shareholder primacy. So now we're looking at business, even large global enterprises, thinking about social impact and social change. We have 500 CEOs who've stepped up to say this matters. This is what's happening in business. Frances, I actually took a moment this morning and went back and looked at your testimony in front of the Senate, and you made this beautiful statement that policies make markets and policies drive markets. And I think that's where we have been. And I think what business is trying to do and is doing now is saying that business can drive policy. Business can push governments in ways that advance both people, place, profit, planet, society. And we're watching companies step forward with real commitment to action, not just words.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Actually, the quote "policy-driven growth" is a phrase that PJ Eddington, who at the time was the IBM government program representative, and I think working with John, that really inspired this phrase, because we knew if you look at technology now, because on this panel we're talking about technology innovation, right? So we are talking about, this is something that has to drive innovation, and this treaty actually puts some new innovation challenge on the table. So I'm going to come back to Charlotte. Actually, Charlotte, for you to relate, I know you are the next gen, right? In terms of as entrepreneur and the startup companies, and from your perspective, how does the CRPD really impacted your thinking and your business and frankly your future?
Yeah, so I think the UN CRPD elevated the status of people with disabilities, not just their rights, but access to things like education, environment, and includes technology as well. And as you've said, the government usually sets the framework and incentives to drive social change, but oftentimes it's private businesses that accelerate this and take these initiatives forward. So as a startup entrepreneur, I can lean on the CRPD to explain to our investors that this is a global policy initiative that has huge and long-term business impact. And frankly, excluding 1 in 4 to 5 people from the workforce is simply a poor economic decision for any country. But I'm also just thrilled to have the opportunity to learn more about this today from the panelists, many of whom were there while this was happening.
Well, I have to commend my panelists. Everybody actually is very net and short, and so we are actually time-wise managed really well. I mean, I do have a more question about technology, what's the impact of today, and what your perspective of the future. But before we go there, I actually want to bring it back in and I talk a little bit more personally. How has the CRPD impacted you individually? Because I think especially we are now in the post-pandemic world where during the pandemic, I mean, actually I shouldn't say post, who knows, it will be another wave coming in. But we all have done a lot of reflection as to who we are as an individual and how we choose to do spend our time and do our work, right? I mean, right now in the United States, actually, I think globally, there is this great resignation, movement going on. People are quitting their jobs. And I can start to say that once I start getting into this, and in 2006, when the UN Convention started getting set in stone, I'm beginning to believe that this is, I always jokingly said this started as a job and then became a career and became a calling, right? It kind of set in motion what I, Frances West, will become. And most of you know that it's actually coming up almost 6 years now since I retired from IBM. I decided to make this my major. And I remember having a conversation with our executives who at the time couldn't quite understand because it was a new idea. And he was like, Frances, what are you doing? You're going to the weeds, like who knows about this stuff, right? But so I want to relate back and then just to ask you all, what is your personal reflection on this and in the context of your professional work? This is a free form, so anybody can speak up.
Frances, this is John. I would add that, or just follow up with that and say, years ago, we used to think that places were not going to be accessible when we went there. Hotels, restaurants, we just had this expectation 30, 40, 50 years ago. And along came civil rights in the United States, and we started believing that things are going to change. And they did. And the ADA has had a profound impact in a lot of ways. And the UN CRPD is also changing the expectations of people. Today, we expect buildings and the built environment to be accessible. And now, especially younger millennials and others can't imagine a world that does not include people with disabilities in all aspects of life. And so the expectations that we have and all of society, especially younger citizens of this world, is that everybody is included. And when they find these barriers exist, they are dumbfounded and can't believe that this is happening. So this is about a major change, a tipping point in the world, and hopefully that will drive it. And I so appreciate Isabel bringing up 2014 and Bob Dole. And I'll just say Bob Dole was sitting in the well of the US Senate, looking his colleagues in the eye. He had helped almost every one of the Republicans get elected. And he sat there and looked them in the eye as they walked out and did not vote for the approval of the UN CRPD, the ratification. And he looked at him and said, shame on you. And he has devoted his life to this day to making sure that the CRPD is ratified by the United States. It's embarrassing to us citizens of the United States.
I'm going to call on Charlotte. Charlotte, I know that you have a personal, story in the sense that the impact of this kind of this field on you and inspired, your action, right?
Yeah, so for me personally, I was inspired to start inclusively after my cousin became the first licensed facialist in the state of Florida with Down syndrome. So it was very evident to me that what she had been told her potential was all her life, and what she was actually able to achieve was far different. And what I wanted to do was see if we could use technology to bridge that gap between candidates and the skills they have and the accommodations they may need to employers and the accommodations they can provide and the skills that they need. And I jumped headfirst into this company with no prior experience in the disability space. So for me professionally, it's because of efforts like the CRPD that there's even an ecosystem that I was able to quickly learn from.
Right. Now, Ambassador, I know when we first met, I was a newbie to a disability business too. Like all of us just kind of fell into it, but we were guided, of course, with people like John, and others that we just knew intuitively that this is the right thing to do. But frankly, we didn't have any real background or experience. And I know you since then, since the early days, has also made this part of your portfolio. So could you share some of that with the audience?
Well, a pleasure, Francis. I have to say that when a negotiation in the United Nations takes place, even the negotiation of the CRPD, an issue that is profoundly human, we had opposition. It's not that the negotiation, went on rails and everybody was very happy. We've run into some roadblocks. I think that John mentioned the internet. It was the first negotiation that expanded outside the halls of the United Nations, which was very good, because the civil society began to participate from afar. And that was unique in the United Nations, and it had never happened. So getting the nations of the state parties of the United Nations to accept a treaty negotiated with the participation of the internet was a difficult issue. More so, it was very difficult to get civil society into the negotiation, because these were countries, nation states, that did not believe that any NGO or any civil society entity should participate there. But I firmly believed that this was an issue about disability, that the persons with a disability were the owners of the issue. We were simply negotiators trying to understand the profundity of disability, but no one else could do the work that they did. The knowledge that people like Michael Stein and Quinn and others brought into the negotiating hall made us more susceptible to this. We also asked all countries to include in their delegations persons with disabilities. So in the long run, it became a worldwide negotiation that recognized the possibility of becoming disabled, that we were part of this negotiation, and that society demanded this as a human right. One of the things that I'd like to point out and underline is that there were a couple of ladies in the back of the room and young women who belonged to an organization that was transmitting this all over the world by internet. And we got the backing of a civil society worldwide. So the negotiation not only happened in the halls of New York, in the UN halls of New York, but also in the capitals of the world. I traveled extensively to China, to Europe, to others, in many countries that were reluctant to become a part. And I also remember traveling to Washington, because Washington, the second Bush administration, was very against a treaty on issues of disability. And John helped us immensely to change that position. So I think you said something that has the right tonality. For me as an individual, it has become a calling. It has become a task which I dearly love. I am also the president of the board of G3ICT. Axel was extraordinary and is extraordinary as a leader of the technology aspects, because Article 9 included for the first time in a treaty the issue of accessibility to technology. Women's rights, the right to life, the right to death, the torture, other articles which were of great importance for the disability movement were discussed, and there were very challenging discussions on these issues. When at the end of the day the document came out and was approved by the General Assembly, it was also a sigh of relief. But when you end the negotiation and have a treaty, it is the beginning of a process. So I would tell you, from 2007, when the treaty was ratified by 20 countries and came into force, we had for the first time in decades, had monitoring of the compliance of countries with a legally binding instrument that became enforceable. 70 countries out of the world did not have legislation on disability when we ended the negotiation. Now all of them have. Now we have private sectors giving the importance that is due to persons with disability, looking at the challenges of their consumer base, which are demanding more inclusivity of women, of indigenous, the rights of children, and disability. So I think we've come a long way and we have a long path to go. And I hope those of you who are younger than us will take the baton and carry this out, like Crosby and Charlotte will have, and Christopher, will have the vision that this is about a more just society. And this begins by the change in ourselves. So I wish you the best also, because it's been a marvelous almost 20 years since we began the negotiations, and it has been a world changer. So I deeply thank God that he gave me the opportunity of working on this process.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I mean, you really is the one that led, kind of up the hill, led us up the hill. And for the audience, I think this is actually a very important point. I think both society and both the public sector and the private sector has evolved in such a way that as a society, this phrase that we heard, public-private partnership, for many, many years, it was just a kind of cliche phrasing, right? And but I can tell you that at least from the time when I was at IBM, or when we look at the quote unquote the emerging landscape, or strategically how you look beyond, because in a technology business, you can never just work on what's in front of you, right? You always have to look ahead and see where the, I guess using a hockey expression, to see where the puck is going, and then you build it back. And we saw this tremendous market movement, and because of demographic, because of technology advancement, because of social expectation now, for example, George Floyd, the Me Too movement, that there is a sea change in the business engagement model. That is, as a business, whether you're a startup or a private or a global company, you cannot just be working within your sphere. You got to connect. And in this case, one of the biggest things I learned early on was, and which went out of quote unquote the traditional business model, is I start connecting with advocacy groups and NGOs, because that's where the knowledge base is. So intuitively, that was the right thing to do for my organization. But then later on, I realized not many people were doing that. And people would say, well, why do you talk to these NGOs, advocacy groups, right? So on that note, I think the model is going to evolve that for business to thrive, you actually have to have a very important, just like in business, we talk about channel strategy. This is a channel strategy. This is an alliance strategy. So on that note, I wonder whether Isabel or Christopher and Crosby, you have anything to reflect in terms of your personal perspective on this.
Yeah, sure. This is, you go ahead, Isabel, then I'll follow.
Yeah. So I was in kind of a unique situation where I was a federal employee at the U.S. Department of Defense, and then went on a federal detail to the Department of Health and Human Services. So I was actually able to comment on the clearance for the CRPD in both agencies. So at the Department of Defense is, how is this affecting service members and civilian employees when they have, a family member with a disability or a civilian employee with a disability? How is it going to impact them? And then at HHS is, what's different from, when we look at the CRPD, where's the areas we still need to work on, when we think of Americans with disabilities, and that was supported decision-making. And at the Department of Defense, it was really about, as other countries ratify the CRPD, the US military is able to, send service members with family members with disabilities to more countries, because the quality of the services they provide are increased or created because of the CRPD. And also, the access issues. We don't want to send somebody that uses a wheelchair to a country where none of the buildings are physically accessible. It's all about quality of life. So I thought about all these things when I was doing the clearance. You know, some of our board members, people like Joan Wodash and Janet Lord, they were there in the basement of the UN working on the drafting of the CRPDs. I noticed there's a question about how is it modeled after the ADA in the chat here. I mean, they really brought that expertise from the ADA to the United Nations. And, you know, when they say the CRPD is modeled after the gold standards of the ADA, it's really, you know, quite true. They looked at the ADA extensively when they were drafting the CRPD. Also, personally, you know, I wasn't testifying like you, you know, for IBM, Francis, but I was kind of on the sidelines with Pat Morrissey. I made an animation to simplify, you know, what is the CRPD for self-advocates? And then we did talking points in English and Spanish for grassroots organizations. And we actually met with the opposition in Pat Morrissey's house, from an attorney from the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, to talk about, you know, what is it going to take to get you guys on board and support the CRPD. So I have some really great memories, professionally and personally, about, you know, around the CRPD and trying to get ratified. And I think that's one of the reasons why I left the federal government, was because I was, you know, so passionate about the CRPD, and it can be really challenging to be a federal employee and march up to the Hart building and almost get arrested. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I think I left. And, you know, also, you know, Francis, that I like to take time off of work and travel to developing countries to give away pediatric wheelchairs through an organization. And so when I meet with mothers coming from rural villages in, for example, Guatemala, it's very important for me, because I'm so passionate, to talk to these mothers about, you know, the convention that your country ratified. You have a national law. They're not aware of any of this. So I make it my responsibility to talk to these mothers. And it's just amazing that these mothers, because of the stigma around disability in some of these countries, they don't even know there's other mothers with children with disabilities in their own village, because they just don't, their children aren't taken outside. So to bring these mothers together and have that conversation about the CRPD, and, you know, and just talk about the future and what people with disabilities in the US are doing as far as employment and technology and things like that, to give those very rich examples, is just eye-opening, and they love to hear that. So that's a little bit background for you.
Right. I mean, you're continue to help really educate, you know, the world on this, what their rights are, but in a very practical, you know, assemble-led way. So, Crosby, you were going to mention something.
Sure. No, I just think Ambassador Gallego said it both. It was so beautifully said that it was both a charge and a call to action for us to pick up the mantle and keep moving forward. And we have to acknowledge the shoulders that we're standing on, and where the work has come and where it's going. I mean, there are people on this call who have taken my hand and said, you know, come with me, and I could highlight those moments. And I've been in this space now for 20 years, and I really, truly have never felt this hopeful. John said it earlier, that this really is a tipping point. I'm seeing a narrative change around how we're talking about disability, how we're seeing disability. Again, I focus on business. Companies are talking about disability in a different way. I encourage people to spend time on social media today and see all of the posts that these global enterprises are putting out, including their CEOs, calling out disability inclusion and why IDPD is critical, why disability inclusion is critical. This is a seed change that we're saying, even to the point of a company like Unilever banning the use of the word normal in all of their policies and all of their marketing materials, because what does normal mean anyway? And like we are evolving this community, my own personal story is an evolution as well. I moved in thinking that I was an ally. Over the course of time, have learned and understood my own disability story and how I identify in my phases with mental health. And so I think we also have to understand the change that can come and the power that can come from storytelling, from an open community, from allies driving change, just like Charlotte is doing with Inclusively. And then we all together are moving this conversation forward. So Ambassador Gallegos, I pick up the charge, I pick up the mantle. I appreciate your words and also where we're all headed together.
Great. Christopher, you've been
quiet, but
yeah,
this is
I know you've
it's unusual.
like Professor Dr. Lee.
Well, you know, it's just, and Crosby, I'm right there with you, and Charlotte, I'm right there with you, and you've got to have partners. You got to believe in each other. You got to trust each other, and you got to move forward because this is hard work. You know, this isn't easy work and changing minds. Just reflecting back real quick, and I know we don't have much time, but when the CRPD was actually, you know, put forward, I was actually doing a startup at a university at that time. And the startup was focused on ensuring that students with disabilities in higher education had access to digital content. And we know publishers and the struggles that we have with digital content and showing these textbooks are accessible. It's unbelievable that we're still in the same place. However, the Mail Trash Treaty came into effect, and that was a complete shift. Still got a lot of work to be done with publishers, but now students with disabilities in higher education around the world have access to digital content, to access to knowledge, which is huge. And personally, that's very important to me because of my struggles with dyslexia and learning disabilities growing up and not being able to read the printed word and all the letters kind of flipped around the page like a fish out of water. So that was a major personal and professional impact that happened to me. And what we're seeing, you know, there's still issues going on that we got funding issues around the world, and we've got skill development issues that we've got to deal with. And that's one of the things that G3ICT and IWP is really working on with partners to develop certifications, to embed people with skills, with critical skills about accessibility, whether it's web accessibility or document accessibility or core foundation knowledge around disabilities into the workplace. Stick them right in the line, keep growing that network. And we believe that is making a change. And we're seeing that growth happen slowly and surely with individuals that want to join this profession, this accessibility profession, which is a network in itself. And there's a shift, Crosby, you're right. There's a tipping point that's happening that John mentioned also. And it's actually really cool to see at this 15-year anniversary time, right? That we're starting to see that shift.
Francis, I have just a quick comment, and that is that the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, 4 days ago came out with a report that said there's been a 17% increase in the number of people who are accessing the internet in the last 2 years. It is at up to now 4.9 billion people. 4.9 billion people have access on a regular basis to the internet. Obviously, broadband is an essential component. Technology pieces are but there are large numbers of people who have access to exactly what Christopher is talking about. But that also leaves 2.9 million or another several billion people who are completely disenfranchised, and 96% of those individuals do not have any connectivity at all. So we can say there's been a COVID connectivity boost because of us being sort of stuck in lockdown, but more people are accessing the internet and looking for information, education, even employment opportunities. The other point I want to make is we have to use our power. And as a CEO of the Viscardi Center, where we said nothing goes out of our place that isn't as fully accessible as it possibly can be as a policy, that is what I expect. This is what I expect at Lakeshore. Nothing goes out of our place that is not fully accessible. And to all the valuable 500, I think you're hearing exactly that they're adopting those kinds of principles and making them institutionalized, so to speak, as part of their mantra. So God bless Valuable 500 and G3ICT and all of you for what you're doing. Charlotte is leading the way in a new platform, and I'm so proud to be a part of what Charlotte is doing. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you all for actually sharing some of your personal journey in the context of the CRPD. And we are actually rapidly coming to the last 10 minutes or so. I can't believe 15 minutes has flown by. We do have a couple of questions that maybe we can just spend some time to talk about. One question is from Evelyn, I think Chiro, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. All of you probably can see is under the Q&A. I think this question is about financing, and the part one question is, can you address some of the financing from the government sector? And the part two is how do we develop workforce, to include people with disabilities? And I know that part two, I would like, Charlotte, maybe you can make a comment, but for part one, in the government sector funding perspective, any comment from the panelists? Have you seen, now personally, I think this is, like I mentioned earlier, I think this is an area where we actually need to move from a kind of a government funded model, which historically the people with disability has been put in more of a subsidy model, right? To a innovation model where the business will be actually enlightened or encouraged to use the private sector investment and funding to fuel the access, the equal access. But any comment from the panelists on this question? This
sure. This is Isabel. I think this really is where Article 32 and international cooperation really comes into this whole topic discussion of governments and even donors, and the projects they fund and making sure that they're disability inclusive. When it comes to ICT, I think of one country just recently that I learned about. It was a project in the Dominican Republic where there was a center that was stood up, and women with disabilities were brought in to learn about computers and then train other women with disabilities and other, marginalized groups about using computer technology. And so that's a great example of international cooperation. It was, funded not by the Dominican Republic government. It was funded outside by another donor. So I think, donors have a responsibility, and also governments. And, there's some really rich examples out there that we can look at. The World Bank does amazing work around, ICT access for people with disabilities.
This is Christopher. Funding always doesn't follow policies, right? Look at the ADA and so on. However, just in the data that we're collecting through the DARE Index, which is an index that is information flows from advocacy groups in these countries. So it's not coming from the government agencies. This data is actually coming from the advocates in these countries. We've seen some amazing numbers jump, as I mentioned earlier. And if the funding is tied to these policies at all, then I'm sure that we're seeing some increase in funding. Just, one of these numbers is the definition of accessibility includes ICT. So that's one, and then also reasonable accommodations definition. So reasonable accommodations with 68% of the data that we have of 170 countries that are involved in this survey came back. And then around the definition of accessibility, which includes ICT, there was only, in 2006, there was only 4 countries at that time that had the definition of ICT. And now it's at 61. So again, we don't have any numbers on the funding aspect, but we're definitely seeing policy shifting and changing, which you'd hope would impact funding, from some standpoint.
Right. There is. So what you're saying is a policy set up, but then there potentially be a little bit of lack. But we definitely see an upward trend globally in this area. Charlotte, can you? Go ahead.
I think that one can't escape the reality we're living in the world today because of the pandemic. I think the major blow to the health systems, which have put all the health systems in the world on their knees because of the pandemic, is one that relates very, very very closely to all of us. This is the first international crisis that has hit 193 countries, but it's the first international crisis that affects each one of us. And that means that we and our dear ones are in the line of fire of death or illness, crippling illness in that sense. But so it's also brought a financial and economic burden and effects on the supply chains and effects on all productive issues that really have been and are going to be a challenge for the world, the entire world. So you will see that society has changed its perception of those who are most vulnerable, because we all have been subject to internet, the lack of internet, the increase of unemployment, the increase of hunger, the increase of poverty, insecurity, and so on around the world. So the societal change, the paradigm is changing, and people are more accepting, are more willing to accept that change and be more inclusive and more and demonstrate more solidarity than before. That being said, a series of negotiations that are extremely important are taking place. There will be a negotiation in the World Health Organization on a new treaty for issues of COVID. I would suggest that the disability community act, and I will be one of those who will be fostering the possibility of entering that negotiation and having disability included in that negotiation. In many cases, we've been successful. We have included disability in different international organizations and different agendas and different reforms, but in some cases we haven't. We weren't able to do this in the sustainable objectives of the United Nations in 2015. We should try that in 2030. Why am I saying this? Because there's a worldwide agenda being drafted now that has to include disability. And many times civil society and the disability society lose the perspective that something like the CRPD can actually be happening in the rest of the organizations, of the multilateral organizations. And we have to put a very serious eye on that. What you mentioned on ITU, G3ICT has worked with ITU very closely on a number of issues on accessibility for persons with disabilities. So we have a very strong relationship with them.
Right.
I think that issue of COVID will be one that will mark the next steps we should follow in guiding and protecting and promoting the rights of persons with disabilities. I'm sorry to have taken so long.
No, so thank you for actually pointing that out. And we'll certainly follow up. Now, I'm going to ask Charlotte to actually make the final comment, especially on the workforce, and then I guess official close of this webinar.
Yeah, so I think the question was just around sort of how do people find ways to get themselves included into the workforce if they haven't found that pathway yet. And I would say that, when we first started this company, kind of the problem we thought we were solving is so different than it is now. There's tons of, training programs and mentorships, et cetera, out there. The problem is, it's very fragmented across nonprofits and government agencies. And, one of the things that we're trying to solve is how do we aggregate all these resources into one place so that if you're actually not ready for maybe a job yet, we can actually create these career pathways that you can find sort of a program that's relevant to you that aligns with a lot of the jobs on our platform. So an example is there's a number of, Salesforce training programs for people who are blind and low vision. This means that, when you can actually acquire a skill set that thousands of companies use, and you can learn to use Salesforce in a really accessible way. But we're building out sort of the training program and apprenticeship side of our platform so that we actually don't just have jobs and are working with inclusive employers, but we're actually creating career pathways for people as well that align to the skills that the workforce is looking for. And I know we're over time, so I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us, especially the panelists. It's incredibly inspiring for me personally to hear what everyone has to say. It's really hard work, but you guys made what we're doing now so much easier, and it's just incredibly motivating. And you guys are just the example of, you know, not giving up. And if you just keep putting one foot in front of the other, you keep going forward. So it was really motivating and inspiring to hear you guys today. So thank you, everyone. And I think we're closing out. Tiffany's also put everyone's LinkedIn information in the chat in case you want to follow up with any of us directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances, for leading us. Happy
Thank you.
IDPD,
Thank
everyone.
you all.
Thank you, Charlotte.
God be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.